My stepmom danced on my father's grave thinking she stole my entire inheritance, but she went completely pale when the lawyer opened a secret will she never knew existed. I watched my stepmom laugh at my father's funeral and I said nothing. That is the sentence I have to open with because everything that followed, every single moment that changed my life in the months after we buried my father, traces back to that afternoon. She stood near the grave in a black dress she had clearly bought new for the occasion, expensive, fitted, the kind of dress you wear when you want to look like a grieving widow but also want people to notice you are still attractive, and she laughed at something her sister whispered to her while the pastor was still speaking. A real laugh? Not a smile she caught quickly. A laugh she let happen and then covered with her hand like it was something she could take back. I stood 3 feet away holding a single white rose my father had requested in his final weeks, and I watched her laugh at his graveside, and I understood in that moment that everything I had suspected about Patricia for 6 years was not suspicion at all. It was simply accurate. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old. My father, Robert, passed away 11 months ago after a 2-year battle with a condition that took him slowly and then all at once, the way those things do. He was 67. He was kind in the specific way that quiet men are kind, consistently and without performance, the kind of kindness that does not announce itself but is simply always present when you need it. He remarried when I was 22, 4 years after my mother passed, and I want to be honest about this, I genuinely tried to welcome Patricia into what remained of our small family. She did not make it easy. Not aggressively. Patricia was never aggressive in any way I could point to directly and say, look, this is the problem, this is the thing she did. She was skilled in a much more difficult kind of behavior to name, the slow and steady work of making herself central while making everyone else peripheral. She had opinions about how my father spent his time. About how often I visited. About whether my visits were too long or came at inconvenient moments. She expressed these opinions carefully, always framed as concern, always wrapped in language about what was best for Dad, and my father, who was a gentleman who did not enjoy confrontation, absorbed them without pushback. I watched my relationship with my father change after Patricia. Not disappear. But narrow. The Sunday dinners that had been reliable became occasional. The phone calls that had been long became shorter. The specific ease we had always had with each other developed a new self-consciousness, like we were both aware of an audience even when she was not in the room. I told myself this was normal. That marriages require adjustment. That my father was happy, which he seemed to be, at least on the surface, and that his happiness was what mattered. I told myself that for 6 years. The diagnosis came 2 years before he passed. I found out not from my father but from Patricia, who called me with the news in a tone I can only describe as managerial. She explained the situation, the prognosis, the treatment plan, the expectations going forward, with the efficiency of someone briefing a contractor rather than telling a daughter that her father was seriously ill. She told me what visits would look like, when they would be convenient, how long they should be. I listened to all of it and then I called my father directly and he answered and his voice was tired in a way I had not heard before, and I asked him how he was really doing and he said, quietly, that he was glad I called. I visited as often as Patricia's schedule allowed, which is how I had begun to think of it, not my schedule or my father's wishes but Patricia's schedule, because she had made herself the gatekeeper of his time in a way that had become impossible to ignore now that he was ill. Some visits she was warm and welcoming. Some visits she found reasons to be present in every room, making private conversation with my father impossible. Some visits I arrived to find that the time had been shortened without notice, that Dad was tired, that perhaps I could come back next week. In his final months, when he was mostly confined to his bed, I began visiting during hours I knew Patricia would be out. I am not proud of the calculation involved. But those hours, the ones where it was just my father and me in the quiet of his room, were the most honest conversations we had managed in years. He talked about my mother. He talked about his regrets, carefully and without naming them directly but in ways I understood completely. He held my hand and told me he loved me more times in those final months than he had managed to say in the previous 6 years, and I understood that the barrier between us had never been him. He passed on a Thursday morning. Patricia called me 40 minutes after it happened. Not immediately. 40 minutes later. I found out afterward that she had called her own sister first. The funeral was managed entirely by Patricia. Which is to say it was managed according to Patricia's preferences, her choice of venue, her choice of readings, her selections of who spoke and for how long. I was given 5 minutes to say something about my father. 5 minutes. I had known him for 34 years and I was allocated 5 minutes in a program that included a 12-minute tribute from Patricia's sister, who had met my father approximately 15 times. And then she laughed at his graveside. And I stood there with my white rose and I said nothing. The weeks after the funeral were a particular kind of disorienting. Grief does not follow schedules, and it does not care about the other things you need to manage simultaneously. I was grieving my father while also becoming increasingly aware that Patricia was moving through the estate process with a speed and confidence that felt deliberate. She had an attorney. She had documents. She had, it became clear, been preparing for this in ways that suggested the preparation had begun well before my father's final months. I learned through a cousin that my father's accounts had been restructured during the marriage. That assets I had vaguely understood to exist had been moved, retitled, reorganized. That Patricia had been present for and involved in financial decisions that I had not known were happening. My father had trusted her. That was clear. What was less clear was whether that trust had been warranted. I hired an attorney named Mr. Collins. Not because I was certain something was wrong. Because I was not certain something was right. He began reviewing what he could access, and within 2 weeks he called me and asked me to come to his office because there were things he needed to discuss in person. I sat across from Mr. Collins in his office and he explained, carefully and thoroughly, what he had found. Patricia had, over the course of 6 years, positioned herself comprehensively in my father's financial life. The will he had on file, the one Patricia had presented to her own attorney immediately after his passing, left the entirety of his estate to her. The house. The accounts. The investments. Everything. My name appeared once, in a clause that left me a specific piece of furniture, a chair that had belonged to my grandfather, and nothing else. I looked at the document. I read my name next to the description of a chair. And I thought about my father holding my hand in his final months, talking about regrets in ways he could not quite name directly. Mr. Collins let me sit with that for a moment. And then he said he had something else to show me. He placed a second document on the desk. He explained that in reviewing the estate, his office had contacted my father's previous attorney, a man named Mr. Albright who had handled my father's legal matters for over 20 years before Patricia had arranged for him to use her preferred attorney instead. Mr. Albright had reached out proactively when he heard of my father's passing. Because my father had visited him privately, without Patricia's knowledge, 14 months before he died. And he had updated his will. I stared at the document on the desk. My father's signature at the bottom. The date 14 months ago. A will that Patricia had never seen. A will that Mr. Albright had held quietly and carefully for over a year, waiting for the moment it would be needed. Mr. Collins looked at me across the desk and said, "Your father planned for this possibility. He wanted to make sure you were protected." I read the document. I read it twice. And then I asked Mr. Collins what happened next. He said, "We contact Patricia's attorney. And we schedule a reading." The reading was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after my meeting with Mr. Collins. Patricia did not know what it was about. Her attorney had been informed only that new documentation had come to light related to the estate and that her presence was requested. I know this because Mr. Collins told me exactly how the communication had been handled, carefully, professionally, giving nothing away in advance. I arrived early. I sat in Mr. Collins's conference room and I drank the coffee his assistant brought me, and I thought about my father visiting Mr. Albright alone, making the drive to his old attorney's office without telling Patricia, sitting across from a man he had trusted for 20 years and telling him what he needed done. I thought about what that decision must have cost him. The awareness it required. The quiet and deliberate love involved in protecting a daughter from behind the scenes when direct protection was no longer available to him. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a man named Gerald who had the specific confidence of someone who does not yet know he is walking into a room where the ground has already shifted. Patricia was dressed well, as she always was, and she carried herself with the ease of a woman who believes the outcome of a meeting has already been determined. She glanced at me when she entered. Something passed across her face, not concern, more like mild curiosity about why I was there, why I had my own attorney, why the room had been arranged the way it had been arranged. She sat down. Gerald sat beside her. Mr. Collins sat across from them. I sat beside Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins opened the meeting by explaining that in the course of reviewing the estate, his office had been contacted by Mr. Albright, who had informed them of a document executed 14 months prior. He placed the will on the table. He explained its origin, its date, the circumstances of its creation. Gerald leaned forward to examine it. Patricia watched Gerald's face. Gerald's expression changed first. Subtle but visible, the look of a professional recalculating. He asked several questions about the document's validity, its execution, the witnesses. Mr. Collins answered each one thoroughly. The document was properly executed. The witnesses were credible. My father had been assessed for clarity of mind at the time of signing. Everything had been done correctly, deliberately, with the specific care of a man who understood that what he was doing needed to be unassailable. Patricia was watching Gerald's face the entire time. And when Gerald sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of someone who has finished recalculating and arrived at an answer he does not want to deliver, she looked at Mr. Collins directly for the first time. Mr. Collins began reading. The house went to me. My father's primary investment accounts went to me. A specific account he had maintained separately throughout the marriage, one Patricia had apparently not known existed, went to me. His personal belongings, his books, his watch collection, the photographs, the items that had existed in his life before Patricia, all designated specifically and clearly to me. Patricia received what my father had described in the document as her fair portion of marital assets, calculated precisely according to what had been jointly acquired during the marriage. Not nothing. But not everything. Not anywhere close to what the previous will had given her. There was a letter. My father had written a letter, the way my mother had always said he expressed himself best, in writing, where he could choose each word carefully without being interrupted. Mr. Collins read it aloud. My father wrote that he loved Patricia. I want to be honest about that because it is true and it is important. He wrote that their years together had brought him genuine comfort after genuine loss. He wrote that he was grateful for what had been real between them. And then he wrote that he had become aware, in his final years, of patterns he had been too willing to overlook. He wrote that he had watched his relationship with his daughter narrow in ways he had told himself were natural but had come to understand were not. He wrote that he had arrived too late at the understanding that love requires protection, not just presence, and that protecting the people you love sometimes means making decisions they will not know about until after you are gone. He wrote that Claire had shown up for him in ways he had not always made easy. That she had navigated restrictions he had allowed to be placed on their time without complaint. That she had loved him consistently and without condition in a way he had not always honored adequately. He wrote that he was sorry for the years he had allowed to narrow. And that this document was his attempt to say, in the clearest language available to him, that he had seen her. That he had always seen her. I was crying before Mr. Collins finished reading. Not quietly. The kind of crying that arrives without warning and cannot be managed, the kind that comes from hearing a dead person speak directly to something you had given up hoping they understood. Patricia's face had gone completely still. Not pale exactly. Still. The specific stillness of someone processing information that has dismantled something they believed was secured. Gerald was making notes. The scratching of his pen on paper was the only other sound in the room besides my crying and Mr. Collins's measured voice finishing the final paragraphs of my father's letter. When Mr. Collins finished, the room was quiet. Gerald spoke first. He said his client would need time to review the documentation. He said there were questions about validity that would need to be explored. He used language that was careful and professional and communicated clearly that he was going to look for an exit from this situation that did not exist. Mr. Collins had anticipated this. He walked Gerald through the documentation with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared for every question that might be raised. Every challenge Gerald suggested, Mr. Collins had a response for. My father had not simply written a new will. He had constructed something specifically designed to withstand challenge, working with an attorney who had known him for 20 years and understood exactly what needed to be bulletproof. Patricia said nothing during this exchange. She sat beside Gerald and she was completely silent and she looked at the table in front of her with an expression I had never seen on her face before. I had seen her confident. I had seen her performatively sad. I had seen her charming and strategic and occasionally cold. I had never seen her look the way she looked in that conference room. Like someone who had built something carefully over years and was sitting in the moment of understanding that the foundation had never been as solid as she believed. The meeting ended. Gerald indicated they would be in touch. They stood. Patricia stood. She looked at me once before she left the room. It was not a long look. It was a look of someone who wants to say something and understands that nothing available to them is worth saying. They left. The door closed. I sat in the conference room with Mr. Collins for a few minutes afterward. He told me what to expect in the coming weeks, the formal process, the timelines, the likelihood of a challenge that would ultimately go nowhere given the strength of the documentation. I heard him, but I was also somewhere else, somewhere in the memory of a Thursday morning phone call that came 40 minutes too late, and a Graveside laugh, and a 5-minute tribute, and a chair left to a daughter as though that was the entirety of what she was owed. Gerald did file a challenge. It took 4 months to resolve. It resolved the way Mr. Collins had predicted, in my favor, completely, because my father had done his work carefully and the documentation held against everything Patricia's attorney attempted. There was a settlement negotiation at the end, which is how these things often conclude, and the settlement reflected the terms of my father's will with minor adjustments that Mr. Collins advised me to accept in the interest of finality. Patricia moved out of the house in month 5. I did not watch her go. I drove past once, not intentionally, and I saw boxes on the front steps and her sister's car in the driveway, and I kept driving. I did not feel satisfaction the way I might have expected. I felt something quieter. Something that had more grief in it than triumph, because my father was still gone, and the house he had left me was still a house without him in it. I moved in 3 months later. Slowly. Room by room. There is something strange about inhabiting a space that holds someone's absence so specifically. Every room had a memory attached to it, some from before Patricia, some from the years of narrowed visits, some from the final months when I had learned to arrive during the hours she was out. I repainted 2 rooms. Not to erase anything. Just to make something new in a space that needed to feel like mine as well as his. My father's chair, the one from my grandfather, the one Patricia's will had allocated to me as though it was the sum of my inheritance, sits in the corner of the room I have made into a study. I work near it sometimes. I do not think of it as a consolation prize anymore. I think of it as the first thing my father secured for me, before he had figured out how to secure everything else. I think about him visiting Mr. Albright alone. Making that decision without telling anyone. Carrying it for 14 months through the final stages of his illness, through the managed visits and the scheduled hours and the 5-minute funeral tribute, knowing that what he had done was waiting. That it would arrive when it was needed. He could not protect me while he was alive in the ways that mattered most. He had let too much narrow for too long before he understood what was happening. But in the one place where his voice was final, he had made sure it was clear. I kept the letter. I have read it more times than I can count. Not because I need to. Because there is something I am still learning from my father's words about what it means to see someone. To witness their patience and their quiet endurance and their love that keeps showing up despite the obstacles placed in front of it. He saw me. He had always seen me. And when he finally had the language and the moment and the uninterrupted space to say so, he said it in a way that no one could take back or minimize or laugh away at Graveside. Patricia danced at his funeral thinking she had won everything. She had not counted on the 14 months of quiet work her husband had done while she was not watching. Some people spend their whole lives taking from others and never understand that the people they take from are often, quietly, making sure the debt gets paid. Not out of cruelty. Out of love. The kind of love that plans ahead. The kind that signs documents in an attorney's office on an ordinary afternoon and then goes home and says nothing and waits. My father waited. And when the moment came, his voice was the loudest thing in the room. The most dangerous thing you can underestimate is the quiet love of someone who has decided to protect what matters, even from beyond the last moment they have left.